I am an ICU nurse. We had a septic patient in the unit. She was 29 weeks pregnant. She went into labor on my shift and we delivered her baby, stillborn. I did post-mortem care on the baby, retrieved the proper transport container, and walked the baby down to the morgue. It was the middle of the night. I'm in an elevator alone. I hear a baby start wailing. I absolutely lose it and rip open the cover, and just as I go to zip down the bag, I hear a calming male voice say,
Hush, little one. I've got you. No need to cry.
The crying stopped immediately. Shaking, I opened the bag and saw exactly what I expected to see. A deceased 29-week-old baby. Now, I am a big bearded 40-year-old ICU nurse, and that was the scariest crap I've ever experienced. No one believes me to this day. I don't even want to speculate as to what the crying or the voice was. I used to work on an oncology ward as a nurse. Our side rooms were kept for end-of-life patients on palliative care, and one patient that we had been nursing for a good few weeks died early one morning. The last offices had already been done by the night staff and the patient moved to the hospital morgue, so all that remained was to clear the room of personal belongings and tidy up. I sent a student nurse that I was mentoring at the time to do this while I got on the drug round. The student had known the patient fairly well and was comfortable with this job. About 10 minutes after, a colleague came to me and told me that my student had come flying out of the side room, white as a sheet, and was sobbing in the staff room. I went to find out what the problem was, and the student told me that she had been clearing out the sink area in the bathroom, had glanced up, and seen the deceased patient reflected in the mirror looking at her over her shoulder. My student was a sensible girl, not given to hysterics, but for the remainder of her placement on that ward, she would not go near that side room. I'm a palliative care nurse who didn't believe in this stuff until I became a nurse. I have 3 to share at the moment. Story 1. Before my time in palliative care, I worked on a medicine unit at the hospital. One night I was returning home from my second break around 3 a.m. or so and saw a man standing in the door of my patient's room. He was white, late 40s to mid 50s, dark hair which was graying, relatively fit, wearing a hospital gown. He was standing at the door with his arms crossed, and as I walked closer, he turned and went inside the room. I followed because I knew it wasn't his room. Our unit was big, 36 beds, so it was entirely possible he was a patient I had not met yet. Anyway, you can guess the rest. Went inside the room, and he was nowhere to be found. I looked under the beds, ridiculous because someone couldn't hide there, in the lockers, washroom, behind the curtains. He was nowhere to be found. Later that night, my coworker had said she felt like someone was touching her feet when she tried to nap on her break. The break room was right next door to my patient's room, and she was in there at the time that I saw this patient. Story 2. Not a specific ghost story, but I just want to say 2 things about working in palliative care. 1, patients often introduce me to deceased relatives around them or talk about people waiting or being in the room with them. 2, a lot of people know they are going to die, and I believe much is seen and heard that folks don't talk about during this time. I believe this because in our younger patients who aren't ready to go, there is often a high degree of anxiety, and many times I have been asked by a younger patient to help me. I'm going to die today, or something similar. Story 3. Once I was doing home hospice, and a younger guy in his 50s was dying of occupation-related lung cancer. Anyway, I knew it was coming and asked his family if they wanted to invite anybody to say goodbye. So the patient's 90-year-old father, brother, extended family, and friends came over at about 1 a.m., and I left them and sat in the kitchen to give them privacy. As I'm in there, I hear this massive burst of wind chimes, which was kind of supernatural, as in did not stop, just a massive burst that went on and on instead of trickling here and there with the wind. A moment later, his daughter came in to tell me he had passed away. I don't usually share my supernatural beliefs about death or dying with families, but I couldn't help but comment on the wind chimes later on, and his wife said, "Yeah, he collected wind chimes. That doesn't surprise me at all," and turns on the light on the back patio, showing me literally hundreds of chimes which had been silent all night until he passed. I'm a hospital doctor in Colorado. I have 3 stories. Story 1. Working overnights and get a page that an old lady with dementia is flipping out. Says someone is in her room watching her around 2 a.m. Got this 3 or 4 times, and we decided to move her to a new room for other staffing issues. We move over an elderly man without cognitive impairment. 1 hour later, boom, same thing. Someone is in the room watching him, and the room is cold. I call Bull and go check it out. Walk in, and the room is so cold, I can see my breath. I have this eerie feeling something is watching me. We move the patient to a new room and leave the room empty all night. Side note, I ran 6 codes over 3 years in that room and never got a single one back. Story 2. Same hospital has a big burn unit. People flown in from around a 5-state radius. There was a Native American man that had had that room for several months. Don't remember how he got burned, but was around 75% body surface area. Keep in mind, every single day, they are washing these burns out, going to surgery every few days to debride. It's horrible and not something I want any part of. Anyways, this guy eventually dies after months of this torture. Shortly after, weird electrical things in there, which I personally witnessed, lights off and on, TV suddenly on at full volume and won't turn off, phone ringing and static on the other end. The nurses would literally walk in the room, say his name, and, "Hey, cut it out," or "Stop." And I kid you not, whatever it was would stop. Every single patient in that room for months after talked about seeing a Native American man. It got so bad that the hospital administrators legit called in a Native American shaman from his tribe to cleanse the room. There was a ceremony and everything. After that, it never happened again. Story 3. This one creeps me out the most. Working at a different hospital, and the on-call room is an old repurposed ICU room. Old hospital that expanded, and they remodeled the old rooms. I'm in there asleep in the chair at 5 a.m. The nurses would sometimes pop their head in the room, so I blocked it with a trash can and a large medicine textbook. I'm drifting off to sleep when the door opens and someone walks in. Kind of looks like my partner that is supposed to be relieving me, but 2 hours early. I had a strong feeling it's a female for some reason. Well, anyways, it walks over to where I'm sleeping, leans over, and hisses in my ear. The worst damn sound I have ever heard. Sounded like an Aztec death whistle. I didn't know it at the time, but I heard it later. I shake myself awake and am freaked out. I figure it's just a night terror, but realize the door is pushed all the way open and the books are holding it open. Never slept in there again. You may not believe me, but these things all happen to me. Hospitals are weird places. Almost everyone that works nights has a hospital ghost story but they aren't likely to tell you because it makes them seem crazy. I'm a chaplain who has worked on hospice. Near-death awareness is a known and accepted phenomena in the hospice community. The dying will begin talking to loved ones who have died, talking about seeing different animals, sometimes old pets, and some even talk about seeing death or an angel of death. The one most interesting to me was a patient I worked with a few months from the time he was in oncology to his decline to death. He was open spiritually, but had no religion. We held conversations about many spiritual things, so he was comfortable talking to me as he neared the end. One day he waited for his family and the nurse to leave and then called me back into his room. He said to me, "I don't want to scare anyone else, and I don't want them to think I'm crazy. I can see death. I can see her out in the parking lot. She isn't ugly. My brother is with her." It should be noted that he had bone cancer located to his pelvis, which eroded it so badly that eventually an artery would burst and they wouldn't be able to stop the bleeding. He was on strong pain medications but had nothing wrong with his brain and was entirely lucid. He talked about his family and his concerns for them and what he was leaving behind. A few days later, he called me into the room. He told me that death was now in the corner and she was calling him. He confessed he hadn't talked to his brother for years before he died, but he was so happy to see his brother with death calling to him. He asked me to pray for him in my own religion, Christianity, because he did not know how to pray before he died. He died that night. I have had numerous other experiences with death awareness, but this one has always stuck out to me. I'm open to interpreting it as the dying psychologically preparing for death. My job is to help them reach the most peace as possible before death. And if this is just psychological, so be it. I know he and others have died well. I worked at a nursing home night shift. I had a coworker who said she was a Wiccan. Not too far-fetched, but she also claimed to see demons in our nursing home. I didn't believe that, but there had already been a few freaky things happen in our center. Knocking on the door, setting off the outdoor motion detectors with no one on the camera monitor, that kind of thing. I'm still not sure ghosts are real, but whenever I think back to this experience, I'm in disbelief about what actually happened. I was on duty alone one night in our Alzheimer's unit. I started hearing some footsteps and the electric sound of a room door opening. They were all handicap accessible. Our nurses' station was a semicircle completely windowed, so I could look around pretty easily and see about half of the residents' rooms and the living room. No one was there, so I went out and individually checked on each resident to see if they got up out of bed. No one did. I went back to my station. I started hearing it again, and it was starting to seriously freak me out. I checked on the residents one more time before video calling my friend from Australia. I was almost in tears because the sound was so clear. I started hearing children's music faintly. It was like a horror movie. Then I looked to my left and saw one of the residents staring at me through the window. It clearly scared the daylights out of me. She looked angry. She pounded her hand on the glass. I hung up the call and went out to help her. Now, this resident is a stroke survivor. You could usually get a general idea of what she wanted, but she was muttering angrily pure gibberish. I asked her questions trying to see what she needed, but she just got more frustrated. I brought her to her room, gave her her medication because it was right around time for it anyways, and she went to sleep. She would pass away from another stroke in 2 days. I start cleaning the building. The spa room, for some reason, always gave me the creeps. This time, I could not clean it at all. The spa room is in a sort of uppercase I shape. The front area is where you get the supplies. Residents can undress, etc. There's a small hall with a shower to your right and a hot tub to your left. The end has a bathroom. In the left corner is always a chair. This night, the chair was in the middle of the hall facing the door. There was no reason for it to be there. If a nurse was helping a resident into the bath, it would have been further back, as that location has no range of motion. If you were to help a resident get undressed, it would be further up. I noped out of there. This is a story that was told to me by a nurse who worked in a nursing home in a small Texas town. Now, in this nursing home, there were 2 wings which were connected by a hallway. Compared to the front wing, the back was always a bit heavy with gloom, maybe even spooky at times. Not sure how to explain it, but there was certainly a darker atmosphere. For some reason, the nurses disliked staying in the back, so after the residents were in bed and the night's last rounds were completed, they would migrate to the front nurses' station. This nightly trek went on for a while until the administration learned of it and, for liability reasons, instructed the back wing nurses to stay in their assigned place of duty. There were always ghostly happenings. Nonetheless, these incidents were mostly shrugged off as the imagination of tired and overworked employees. But there was one incident in particular that was quite terrifying and witnessed by several people. One resident, Mr. Gomez, was rumored to have been into witchcraft throughout his life. Late at night, Mr. Gomez, according to reports from other residents, would creep into their rooms like a serpent born of hell. He would slither on his stomach, his arms at his sides. His eyes would be rolled back in his head, his tongue darting in and out of his mouth, flicking the air like a human snake. He would crawl under their beds and try to push them off. He's the devil, the other residents would claim. Well, the reports weren't taken very seriously. After all, these old folks were half out of their minds, and realistically, how could feeble old Mr. Gomez, who needed the assistance of nurses just to get out of bed, be physically capable of such actions? The nurses all agreed that the reports were just imagined stories of old confused people. That is, until the terrifying night that the nurses all became believers of the evil that lived within Mr. Gomez. It was well past midnight. The residents were sleeping, and the halls were quiet. The nurses had gathered in the back lobby to sit and wait for morning. Most of them were at the point of dozing off when a loud gasp broke the silence. One of the nurses stood up, a frightful expression upon her face. She pointed down the hall towards the residents' rooms. As the others turned to look, a horrifying scene unfolded. It was Mr. Gomez, slithering on his stomach, making his way down the hall and into the room of a slumbering woman. They just stood there, petrified, unsure of what to do. Mr. Gomez was now crawling through the hallway, heading right towards the lobby, and the fear struck the nurses. The stories were true. Mr. Gomez was slithering like a snake, his eyes rolled back, and his tongue flicking in and out like a cursed beast. They watched as he snaked through the lobby furniture, crawling between chair legs and hissing at the shocked women. The nurses all ran up the hallway to the front desk. The doors to the back wing slammed shut as the last one passed through. They stayed up front for the next few hours, and as the sun began to peek over the horizon, they gathered enough courage to go check on the back wing. Everything was quiet, and Mr. Gomez was once again sleeping in his bed. A few nights later, Mr. Gomez passed away. As the nurses were attending to his body, several loud thumps were heard against the window. They pulled open the drapes to see what could have made that noise, and just as they did, an owl flew at the window, clawing at the pane as if trying to get in. The bird then flew into a nearby tree and landed among several other owls perched high in the branches. The birds just stared down at the room where Mr. Gomez lay dead, waiting to claim his soul. I've worked in a small family-run nursing home for 6 years as a nurse aide. It was an orphanage before it became a nursing home, and unfortunately, before being shut down, the orphanage had a history of severe abuse and neglect. Unfortunately, it's not gossip. The owner herself has told us, when residents get close to death, they always see a little girl. One of my patients, a very alert gentleman who knew all of our names and was very alert and oriented. I was passing dinner trays and saw that he had his back turned and was talking and laughing in the corner. I knocked and asked him who he was talking to, and he chuckled and said, "This little girl came into my room. She was scared." He died 3 days later. About 6 months later, I had another patient screaming about a little girl grabbing his feet, and she needed to leave him alone. He died that night. She has always come up over the years. It's always the same thing. They see her, and then they die. Other coworkers have had the same experience. It's very unsettling.